So very few people understand the inner workings of Maricopa County elections and balloting than Stephen Richer. He was the county recorder during the infamous Cyber Ninja audit of 2020 election results. And now, all these many years later, here we are again. Stephen, welcome and thank you. What is going on? Now we know that there are two investigations of the same election of 2020.
Yeah, so it's Groundhog Day, isn't it? I'm sure you're having lots of feelings of deja vu just because when you were at the Republic covered the Cyber Ninjas review extensively. Republic obviously also covered the 2020 elections extensively and all the subsequent investigations. And I'm a little surprised that we're potentially going to be doing this again. I'm very disappointed, but it looks like, according to reporting from The Atlantic, it looks like HSI, which is a division of the Department of Homeland Security, is looking at things pertaining to Arizona's 2020 election. And just last week, or was it earlier this week, we saw a subpoena to Senate President Warren Peterson, who was still holding a lot of the digital information from the 2020 election. And presumably that's pursuant to some sort of investigation that the FBI wants to do about the 2020 election.
Do you have any indication? Because I don't, and you are correct. You know, when I was at the Republic, we followed this very closely, the circus that happened in Maricopa County. But what kind of evidence would possibly justify this new investigation? Help us understand that.
So we know a little bit about what the HSI investigation is potentially digging into, whether it's non-citizens participating in past elections, or supposedly, according to that article, whether ballots were returned after 7 p.m. on election day. Now, that's a false allegation. We don't know that they actually believe it, but according to the Atlantic article, that was something they were looking into. We have no idea what the FBI may or may not be looking at with respect to this data. The only thing we know is that they've opened an investigation and that it's somehow connected to the 2020 election. For all we know, they could be looking to see if China electronically interfered with the 2020 election. They didn't have to say what their theory of the case was. They didn't have to say if they're investigating a particular person. They didn't have to say if there's a specific criminal statute that they're looking at. So we really don't know a lot yet on that one.
Is there a way that we can find out? Clearly, we have been trying as reporters, but as you noted on social media, the actual ballots of the 2020 elections do not exist. So talk us through the process of why that is the case and what is it that they might be looking for then in terms of, I think you mentioned the digital data.
Right. So a lot of people have tried to say, well, Maricopa County is the next Fulton County, Georgia. And of course, a few weeks ago in Fulton County, Georgia, the FBI got a warrant to go to Fulton County's election facility and take the physical ballots and boxes of information from the 2020 election. Unlike Fulton County, Maricopa County no longer has the physical paper ballots. It destroyed those after the statutory retention period. And Maricopa County also no longer has the tabulation equipment from the 2020 election. So it's very different in that respect. As for how can we know? The only person who knows about the subpoena is Warren Peterson, as well as anyone who Warren Peterson shared it with, maybe some other people at the Senate. I haven't seen any reporting as to who signed that subpoena, if the subpoena had any specific information about what they're looking for. And then, of course, anyone involved in the investigation, but they haven't said anything yet. Now, we do know that Senator Peterson had in his possession all of this digital information from the 2020 election. And he had that because that material had been handed over by Maricopa County to the Cyber Ninjas in 2021 when the Arizona Senate asked the Cyber Ninjas to do an additional review of the 2020 election. So that includes things like the images of the ballots. That includes things like the images of the ballot affidavit envelopes on which voters signed to return their mail ballots. That includes things like voter files, voter registration files, the cast vote record, and anything else that can be stored digitally pertaining to the 2020 election.
Including social security numbers, because I know a lot of people are asking about that.
Right. So that information was never provided by the county to the cyber ninjas. And so presumably Warren Peterson wouldn't have that information. And presumably, therefore, the FBI does not have that information as a result of the subpoena that they just issued. Now, the Department of Justice has sued Arizona, among many other states, asking for the entire voter registration database. Secretary Fontes is fighting that in court, and he's quite adamant that he's not going to yield on this particular topic. The voter registration database, at least components of it, is public records, and the Department of Justice could simply make a public records request to the Secretary for the whole statewide voter registration list. What is not public record is the last four of your Social Security, your 10-digit driver's license, your signature, and other things that are enumerated in either state or federal law. And so Secretary Fontes has taken the position that it would be unlawful for him or for any of the counties to give that information over to the Department of Justice. That's a position that's been taken by, like I said, many other states who are involved in this litigation. And so far, that litigation is going pretty well for the states.
Why would the federal government want such detailed information, and how can they possibly use information as your name, social security, essentially your whole life?
Yeah, so I don't know on that one, and I know a lot of people have speculated, and you as a savvy consumer of national and state politics can speculate as well or better than I can. I've seen some people say, this is to assist with their pursuit of people being in the country unlawfully. This is to help clean up voter rolls and remove non-citizens from voter rolls. I've seen people just saying that they want to create a master voter registration database, either for good purpose or for bad purpose. But right now, it's important to remember that states and counties are the custodians historically of voter registration information. There is no, and there never has been, a national voter registration database.
What is the danger of that, though, for the federal government to have access to that detailed information?
Well, I think somebody like Secretary Fontes would say, regardless of what the danger is, it's against the law for me to hand this over, so I'm not going to do it. Now, he would probably also say that he doesn't want the federal government to have this master database for privacy concerns, maybe for, again, pursuing I don't know, certain people, political enemies. I don't know, and maybe I lack the imagination to think of nefarious things that the federal government could do. I understand it merely from we never handed out that information when people asked for it in Maricopa County, unless there was a specific legal reason for us to be doing that. And so we wouldn't have handed it over to the Department of Justice if they had just made a public records request. And indeed, that is like I said, the position that most states are taking.
Now, we also know that Adrian Fontes, the Secretary of State, and Chris Mays, the Attorney General, they're asking the counties not to comply if they received similar requests or subpoenas. So you were the county recorder during the Cyber Ninjas, and we know how difficult that is for election workers who are nonpartisan, who are just doing your jobs. What kind of impact does this have on election workers who are now will have to do elections again this year and face this kind of pressure or scrutiny?
Yeah, I'm somebody who always wants to assist with law enforcement. I have great respect for law enforcement. So I would have wanted to get to yes, and I can empathize with the counties who say, Well, the Department of Justice, the FBI, they're not our enemies, so I wanna help them out. I think the reason why Secretary Fontes and Attorney General Mays sent that is that they wanted to clearly let the counties know that in their reading of state and federal law, it would be unlawful for them to do that. And so therefore, then the state and the counties would be potentially pitted against each other. Now, as to the question about what does this do to election administrators, I think it makes election, if nothing worse, it makes election administrators occasionally take their eye off the ball. And the ball is administering elections, local elections throughout this year. Like we just had a race in Tempe for Tempe City Council. And then, of course, we have the primary, the statewide primary in July. And then we have the very consequential midterm elections in November. And that is where the focus should be. And unfortunately, conversations that have arisen out of the FBI's most recent subpoena, and some of the other litigation going back and forth between the Department of Justice and the states have given rise to a lot of theories on the internet about how election administrators are not complying with the law or aren't doing their duty or doing something even worse, something crooked. And then that has downstream effects of lots of hate towards the average people who are working elections. And it also means that a lot of Americans lose confidence in elections. And I think that if you look back at Georgia in 2021, shortly after the presidential election, they had a U.S. Senate special election, and that was on January 4th,
Right.
2021. And Republican turnout in particular was decreased. And I think that's probably in part because of all the things that President Trump had just said about the November 2020 election. And they might have thrown their hands up in the air and just said, like, why would I even bother? And so, what's one of the things that saddens me about recent developments is that after the 2024 election, Republican confidence in election administration went up considerably. Now, some people say that was for the right reasons, some people say that was for just for political reasons. But unfortunately, that's coming down again, as is the confidence of Democrats and independents, who I think are really worried that the federal government could somehow interfere with the administration of the midterm elections. And so we're seeing decreased confidence across the board in whether or not the upcoming elections will be fair, accurate, and lawful.
Well, let's go back to the beginning. You did not see any evidence whatsoever of widespread fraud of the 2020 elections. Fast forward, Donald Trump won. We all respected the vote. We respected the results. What do you think, again, is going on here? What's the end game?
Yeah, so it's always worth reaffirming that yes, every single piece of evidence that was admissible in court, every single piece of credible evidence that was raised by election administrators affirms that President Trump lost the 2020 election, President Trump won the 2024 election. And I think that any further dispute of that is really not doing credit, not doing favor to the field of election administration. What is the end goal of all this? I think some of it is politics, in that many in the president's base, remains an important issue. I think the president's ego is a component of this. I think it's very hard for him to process that he did lose to Joe Biden. He obviously doesn't think highly of former President Biden. And the more cynical out there suggest that this is all to create a pretext for some federal government involvement in the 2026 midterm elections, such as the federal government coming in on election day and seizing ballots or seizing tabulators in the middle of the election process and then throwing that into disarray. That would be unprecedented, at least in the last 100 years in the United States. And it would put us in a really dark place for American democracy. And I've consistently said that looking back at elections, when we've done the tests, when we've done the reconciliations, when we've done the post-election audits, we can say with a very, very, very high level of confidence if the election was administered fairly and lawfully. if it's disrupted during the process, then I think that puts us in a very different, more challenging situation.
We don't want to see that for sure,
No, we don't
Stephen
want to see
Richard.
that. Yeah.
Stephen Richard, the former Maricopa County recorder. And thank you for being at it. And thank you for setting the record straight here and everywhere else where you have the opportunity. I think that's so essential. Anything else?
I'll put in my plug for what you and for what others are doing, because I always said that the conversation about election administration and democracy was one front in a broader war on what is true and what is fact. And I think so critical to that conversation is journalism. And so I'm glad that you're staying in the game in a different capacity now. And so I follow the post, and I know that you're pursuing topics of special interest to you now, and I'm glad that election administration remains one. So thanks for having me here.